In a world where the internet has killed cinema, 3 guys are determined to help show that it's not dead. And what better movie to show that than with Quentin Tarantino's new movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. A movie about a fading actor and his best friend / stuntman trying to remain relevant in the ever-changing times of 1969 Los Angeles. So we got a movie about struggling to stay relevant in an era where cinema and the landscape of movies itself is changing. Only thing I'm going to say to that is, sound a little bit familiar, guys? Just a little bit? Right. I'm Dom, I'm the movie nerd. I'm back with the next episode of Talkin TV with my buddy Chris Ivanko over here to the left of me.
What's going on, guys?
And my other buddy, Johnny Manna. Hey, Johnny, I thought you were only like a guest star on the first episode.
Yeah, well,
No, Johnny's our guest. Yeah. He's this week's guest, yeah.
I'm this week's guest, too. Thanks for inviting me back, by
You're
the
welcome.
way. I'm happy to be here again.
Anytime.
You are the best guest of all the guests.
You are...
Out of all the guests you've had?
Yes.
Yeah.
There must be so many.
You are
wow, I'm
the
honored.
absolute best. Out of the
Who
two
is
guests,
the
out of the
last
2
guest?
guests that we've had, the other one being yourself, you are 100% the best.
So I'm
You
better
are
than
This
better
is
than
why we just critique the film, not write it.
Exactly.
So I'm better than myself.
We are
Wow.
commentators. There's a reason why 99.9% of the internet are commentators, not actual creators. And the other 1%, when they do create stuff, well, that's what we're here for, to comment on it.
So, Dom, you're the reason I saw this film,
Yes.
and because of me seeing this film, Johnny's the reason
Yeah.
that
It's like
you
a
know,
whole continuing
we're-
train
I-
of
train.
just passing down word of
And
mouth.
I was the reason why Dom saw it, so...
Right.
Yes,
so with that
that's
being
exactly
said,
what happened.
it seems to keep coming back to Dom. I think we can all agree
What can
on
I
that
say?
right
I'm
now.
just the center of attention. I can't help myself.
So, Dom, start us off. How do you want to take this conversation?
Is the supposed 9th film from Quentin Tarantino, even though it's technically his 10th if you want to go all technical about it. It is a movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt as Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth, an actor-stuntman pair that Tarantino himself likened to a combination similar to the likes of Burt Reynolds and Hal Needham from the 70s. And kind of with this movie... First off, it's not, I should get this out of the way first. It's not a conventional movie in any way, shape, or form. I want to get that out of the way immediately, because I know that there are... The reception for this movie has been primarily positive, but for the most part... but there are still, a few naysayers, and of course the usual Tarantino critics that have come out, and of course more clickbaity journalists that ultimately provoke and get even more hilarious and bizarro, outlandish responses from Tarantino. Check out the clip from his Cannes interview if you want more evidence as to what I'm talking about. But yeah, with this movie, Tarantino's described it as his magnum opus, and I really
did he?
do.
I didn't know that.
He has described it as that, and I kind of really do have to agree with that. And that this is kind of, I said this when I wrote my initial review for this. This is a film I can tell that Tarantino's been wanting to do for a very long time. It's no secret that he is a lover of classic film. He loves movies. He lives and breathes the stuff. Like, just the way he talks about it. And I might be fanboying out a little bit, but that's also kind of like, I don't know, I see Tarantino in interviews, and just the way the guy presents himself and the way that he talks about it, I don't know, he kind of reminds me a little bit of me. Because, like, you guys both know me. You guys both know the type of person I am. I'm a little bit fritzy. I'm a little bit on the edge. When I get going, I kind of don't stop unless, like, somebody
Right.
kind of cuts me off.
You have a blatant foot fetish.
Clearly, yes, I've a very, very obvious foot fetish. But yeah, I found that this is kind of the film that, like, Tarantino has been wanting to make for a long time. Yeah, he kind of got the stigma of, he's the guy that likes to play around with structure in the mid-90s when he came out with Pulp Fiction, which... Again, if you want to talk about just, like, objectively movies that changed the game, like, regardless of everybody else's, I know people, my mom still famously hates Pulp Fiction. She has said that it is one of the worst movies ever made. And, like...
Hi, Mom.
But the fact of the matter is, like, you in terms of movies that changed the game, right? Not like, just quality acting-wise, everything else, cultural standpoint aside, this movie changed the game. In terms of how movies are perceived, just from a structure standpoint, and for, like, what audiences are able to tolerate from their feature films alone. And kind of every movie that he's done since then, with the exception of, I would say, one, it almost feels like he's kind of been trying to do this exaggerated take on the movies that he loved growing up, like with Kill Bill, with the samurai, with the references to the old samurai movies, and with Django Unchained and Hateful Eight for the westerns, and Inglourious Bastards. I would probably say Inglourious Bastards is probably the closest he came to replicating the kind of, like, structure that kind of made Pulp Fiction great, albeit, like, a lot more, I would say, straightforward in that Inglourious Basterds, with the exception of a few scenes, has a mostly linear plot. Yeah, it bounces back and forth between two different sets of characters, but it still has a mostly linear forward-moving plot versus Pulp Fiction, which is all out of order. And with this movie, I would say that it's not conventional by any means or shape, but it's probably his most subdued effort yet. And I ultimately think that's what makes this something more than A, just the rest of his filmography, and B, more than just the rest of the films that I feel like I've seen in the rest of 2019.
Just from what you just said, would you say that there's any divisive intention he has with that type of style of unconventional movies?
In terms of what that he goes out of his way to make it that way?
Not necessarily going out of his way, but just if he makes it thinking like some fans are gonna hate that it's like this, and some of the audience is gonna.
So you mentioned the word fans there. Tarantino is not a guy like audiences. That's
so. Are you asking? Do you think there's a cynical part to Tarantino that enjoys being as polarizing as he most often is?
Maybe not cynical, but just in terms
of Tarantino,
if he's thinking about if he's conscious of it,
creative intent,
divisive,
right? Is there creative intent in creating something that's divisive?
I mean, there's definitely creative intent behind it.
This was just my question for Dom.
Well, there's creative intent behind the movie, but do you think? I also would like to know. Do you think I want to expand on what Johnny's saying? Do you think that Tarantino sets out to be divisive and sort of destructive in a sense with his art?
Okay, so there we go. So destructive, yes. Divisive, not intentionally. I think at this point, Tarantino has always been the kind of guy, and he said this for in multiple things. Tarantino has made that stigma of he is the guy who does not give a fuck about what anyone thinks. Tarantino has made that stigma apparent from the get-go, and that he is the guy that it doesn't matter what you're asking, it doesn't matter. My films are about what I want them to be about, and you are going to get from them what you want. And if you try to question me in any way, shape, or form in terms of, am I going out of my way? He's not the kind of guy that's going to get thrown off by somebody who's saying, what was your purpose behind not including enough of Sharon Tate in this movie, to which he responds, I reject your hypothesis, because I did what I mean, legitimately that was his response, and he didn't need to go more into it, because what that said to me is, again, it's just keeping in terms of what Tarantino has been doing since day one, and that he is going to do what he does, and he doesn't give a shit about what the culture, the landscape, whatever is going on at the time, is going to think about his stuff.
If I'm not mistaken, wasn't that a politically correct motive behind asking that question to him?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because I know many people, not just critics and people working in the industry, but people in general who had a problem with what he did with Sharon Tate. But I actually have a few reasons as to why I kind of am foreboding of this, because I'm not gonna lie, this is probably the first time ever that I've ever actually paid attention and actually thought, there may be some merit to some of this criticism, because most of the time I usually just deflect it as more liberal propaganda, and just more so it's just PC, product of the time, people just don't like Tarantino. Because I always find it hilarious, when the whole Me Too scandal happened, and that nobody kind of really brought up Tarantino's name, and the few times that it was brought up, it was shot down immediately, because it's guys, people have been trying to slander and take down Tarantino long before Me Too was even a thing. They didn't take him down then, they're definitely not taking him down now.
Right. Now, why do you think that when we speak about a Tarantino movie, as opposed to other directors, we're starting off not talking about the movie, but him as a person?
Because he's made himself a personality. And that's not just through force of his directing. We talk about other directors that, have become tour de forces through their work, right? Like a Christopher Nolan, like a Martin Scorsese, like a Stanley Kubrick, like a Paul Thomas Anderson, to the point where it's not necessarily that you recognize it because they're synonymous, but you recognize them not just because of how many great iconic movies they've made, but also because of just you feel like they have a certain style to them. Tarantino, besides having a very apparent and obvious style, has also gone out of his way is that he's a personality. It's not just a matter, and regardless of how we may be able to separate the art from the artist, there's ultimately a part of you that's going into your art, right? That's the whole point, right? Art is supposed to be creative, freedom, extension expression of yourself, right? Exactly. So no matter what happens, you're gonna see a piece of Tarantino in his work, and because Tarantino has made himself such this I honestly can't even think of another word to use, enigma behind the scenes, that he just has this incredible, crazy personality, and everybody that's worked with him has said the same thing about him. They have said, yeah, this guy, lives and breathes what he is. Yeah, he has certain personality quirks, but, what you see from Tarantino, that is Tarantino. And I think another thing that comes to it, too, is that he's one of the few actual genuine people in Hollywood, right? You may not like his personality, but at the very least, you can't say that he's never once been anything but consistent.
And so with that being said, I think that's a great segue into the strongest resonating factor of this movie that hits me in the heartstrings is the fact that, yes, that comes across. He is himself. He is unapologetically going to create art that he wants to create, and I cannot thank him enough for this movie,
especially in the year 2019.
Especially in the year 2019.
Like, don't get me wrong, like, just this movie existing in general is amazing enough, but the fact that it's this movie existing in 2019, the year that I already said is famously, like, made it even more apparent that streaming is killing the movie theater and the idea of traditional cinematic endeavors. Like, I am so effing glad that this movie exists and was able to be released in the summer, too, of all time periods, too. That's what's crazy, because his last 2 movies were winter releases.
Right, and so the reason I would love to walk up to him right now and shake his hand and thank him for this movie is because I'm sick of the spoon-fed formulaic films, aka Marvel, aka DC, even Star Wars.
Comic brand that you like
is yeah. I mean, look, this is all about being honest and talking about what I like and dislike about my favorite things. I mean, I still love Star Wars, but I hate what's happening to it right now. And so for me, I think that this movie resonates on 2 layers. One, it resonates on the grand scale that you can have a successful movie that isn't a part of an intellectual property in 2019 and follows a classic movie format shot on film. You know what I mean? It has all the workings of why Hollywood became what it is. And 2, the most important thing is, I think that young people need to get their history up. If you want to create, you need to know about music. If you're a musician, you need to know about the artists that inspired the artist you're listening to. You need to know about the filmmakers that inspired the filmmakers you're watching. Because A, you're going to inevitably do something that has already been done, in my opinion, if you don't know about the classics, and B, you have a more informed experience. And so I think this movie is Tarantino telling the film industry, guys, listen, what are we doing? We need to wake up and realize that there's a reason movies are going out of business. There's a reason that people are switching to sitting at home. We're not giving them a reason to get off their couch and go to the theaters, like you said, and I think it's because there's a lack of film history and there's a lack of respect for the classics, and so this is what happens when you rely on social media culture to perpetuate your film. Meme culture should not be the driving force behind a movie. I think we need more scenes like in this movie when he's saying the lines and he's yelling and they slow pan back. And then he calls the line back when he's like doing the guest star on the pilot of the Western. We need more scenes that challenge you and make you sit through them, because that's art. I mean, those were beautiful scenes. And so I thank him for this movie. And I would love to know, like, what, honestly, Johnny, as someone who's not as deep into film as you are music, you're creative, so you see things differently, and so we value your opinion. That's why you're on the show. But, like, do you agree with what we're saying about this? And what do you think about that as just more so the consumer? Because me and Dom went to film school. You've been around us. You've gotten that knowledge, but you have more of like just an artist approach, an untrained eye, if you will.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting that I agreed with that you brought up was how you're kind of sick of seeing the same like Marvel and like popcorn action type of movies. That I feel like it's been a combination of just that and then all of the movies that win Oscars that a lot of people have never even heard of or have never even seen, and I feel like it's refreshing to see a movie that didn't really fall into either of those categories coming out now. And yeah, as someone who has never even really been that much of a consumer of Quentin Tarantino specifically, not that I've had any dislike for him or anything like that, I just have never really got around to seeing a lot of his movies, I definitely thought it was interesting to be able to experience how unconventional his structure is in his film. And yeah, it was definitely something that I wasn't really prepared for, and it kind of made it so that it took me a little bit after the movie to be able to formulate what I really felt about the movie, because throughout the whole thing I kept kind of thinking to myself, like, what is this movie actually about? And then kind of, I don't know, just in a lapse of time after the movie, I was kind of finally able to put that together for myself, which I think it's interesting. I think, Dom, you mentioned it on how it's just all about what you get out of it.
So this has been a big topic of discussion based on what I've read and what I've heard about this movie. What is this movie about? Johnny, How did this movie resonate to you? Like, what is this movie about, Johnny?
First of all, Brad Pitt's character is a great friend.
Right?
He is like
just a great guy.
He is the best friend to have.
Besides
to
the
me,
fact
that is the
like,
standout performance
the
of
definition
this movie.
of cool.
Yes,
in
that is the one thing that
just
I
when
hate.
you thought Brad Pitt had reached his pinnacle, he went and showed
pulls
you that
this
there
out.
is still so much to learn. And I think Brad Pitt's performance, as much as Tarantino making this movie is like a slap in the face to young creators, I think this is Brad Pitt telling them, you never stop learning, do not get complacent, keep challenging yourself in roles that you may not find yourself in. I feel like everyone going into this movie, if you didn't know about casting, you would think that Rick Dalton would be Brad Pitt and Leo DiCaprio would be Cliff Booth.
Yeah.
But they flipped that. They took Brad Pitt out of the godlike role, and he challenged himself, and I really think it paid off.
Especially because, that part was originally going to be Tom Cruise.
I did not.
Yeah, because that was the whole big thing is when this movie was first getting into production. Because the whole thing is that, again, talking about how Hollywood kind of uses big events to their advantage. But I was about to say, because newsflash, kids, Hollywood doesn't give a fuck about Me Too. The only reason why they did is because there were enough people complaining about it on social media for it to actually like make a dent in their wallets. Hollywood could give less of a fuck about that. But yeah, so when Tarantino was kind of using the whole Me Too scandal and like, him separating from the Weinstein Company, because this is also famously the first movie that he's done that was not distributed by the Weinstein Company. It was distributed by Sony. And, what's it called? And when they were first announcing casting, the whole big thing was that, he was circling a ton of big people, Leo DiCaprio, Margot Robbie, the big stink when they announced that Pacino was going to be in this movie, because besides the fact that this is the first time that Pacino's ever worked with Tarantino, also this is kind of a comeback year for Pacino, as he'll also be in the new Scorsese movie, The Irishman, later this year, which also marks the first time that he's ever worked with Scorsese. So the fact that 2019 gave us the first time Al Pacino's worked with both Tarantino and Scorsese is already ridiculous enough in and of itself. But I remember the big thing when a lot of those first initial casting and rumors were circling around is that Tom Cruise was originally going to be in the movie. And then they eventually shuffled him out and they brought in Brad Pitt. But yeah, I don't know. That's just one of those kind of alternative what ifs that I always wondered. I'm like, yeah, this was great watching it, but man, what if it had been this part, Because Tom Cruise, obviously, he's not to the same level, I would say, that Brad Pitt is, but like, he's definitely obviously a superstar in his own right, and he kind of like similar age to Brad Pitt. He's only a year older than Brad Pitt, like kind of similar build, not the exact same kind of vibe, but similar kind of vibe. I'd say Pitt's probably a little bit more of an interesting personality.
I thought they were identical twins. Were they not?
Who, Cruise and Pitt?
Yeah.
I can't tell if you're joking right now.
No.
This might be a little bit of my autism that I'm convinced that I have, but oh, whoops, probably not a good thing to drop on a podcast. Anyways,
okay, I don't know. Just to get back to your original question, like the big thing that stuck out to me is Brad Pitt is an amazing friend. Leonardo DiCaprio, not as good of a friend, but you also didn't really hate him as a character.
Right.
But I also really like how you brought up the idea that Quentin Tarantino is kind of trying to pitch to the current generation of creatives to like not forget about the classics, because I kind of think when you're living in our generation with social media and instant gratification, it's easy to fall into the mindset. Basically, there's this whole thing where we're basically standing on the shoulders of great people who created all these classics, and it's easy in our mindset for us to think that we're flying.
It's the Samuel Tarly line from Game of Thrones. I'm sick of reading about the endeavors of better men.
And so I think that's why this movie sort of is making us ask, what was it about? Because yes, at times it did feel like you said, Johnny, when we walked out of the theaters, a collection of great scenes that were put together in a movie that maybe didn't work so well, right? But I don't think this movie was I want to believe the intent of this movie was meant to be ambiguous for you to, in a sense, feel bad about yourself as a consumer, but in a way where it doesn't leave you feeling like nasty or dirty for maybe supporting Disney for all of those Marvel movies, or for supporting Fox for all of those Spider-Man movies in the early 2000s. Sony. Maybe in a way, I think it's meant to make you open your eyes and be like, I can be better, and I can help us get back to getting more movies like this. Like, I think that this whole point of this movie being so empty, and I will use that word, is because it's super interpretive.
Hold on, I want to talk about that real quick. Empty in what sense?
Well, it's very interpretive. I mean,
okay,
like,
I wouldn't exactly call that empty though. Like,
but the meaning to me was more so like for example, Sharon Tate, right?
Right.
what really was that story there?
Oh, okay, all right.
I think that was more so like an homage to a time in Hollywood that has gone.
I agree.
And so, like, the movie, I think, would have been more streamlined if you didn't have her and if you didn't have them living next door. Maybe there was just, like, one touch upon it, and then at the very end, he can go up there, and you can have, like, that moment where they meet for the first time. But I think that was more so for his political statement rather than it was for the sake of the script, which is fine.
So in terms
it's his
of
art.
So in terms of touching on the Sharon Tate stuff, I'm gonna explain to you real quick, just in terms of why I would say that was probably, in terms of, again, what everyone is gonna perceive as the most political minded political part of the movie. I'm gonna tell you right now that it was confirmed that it's the least political part of the movie, because the whole reason of him wanting to include Sharon Tate in the movie at all is because, again, the fact of the movie being about 1969, and it really sucks that this was pitched, at least to consumers, as a movie about the Manson murders, when, quite frankly, the Manson murders are almost kind of an afterthought when it comes to it, because the way that he pitches it is that the Mansons and the Manson family was a part of this time, but this is that they're not who this movie is about. Not at all. And so it kind of bouncing off of a point that we brought up when you asked about in our Stranger Things episode, right? When you kind of asked setting versus character, right? About whether Stranger Things is about the characters or Hawkins Indiana. I said it was about the characters. This one, I would say, is a situation where, as great as the characters are, he's using the characters as an outlet for the setting for this time. Because with the way that he shoots the scenes, the way that the meticulous detail that he puts in the production design, you can tell he is trying to tell a story about 1969 Hollywood. That is the focus of this story. And the Mansons were a part of that. And so bringing that back to Sharon Tate. So when he was writing the part for Sharon Tate, he obviously reached out to her sister and he consulted with her a lot. And when he kind of explained to her what he was going to do with the ending of the movie and how he was going to kind of pull another Inglourious Basterds in terms of how he was going to do another history flip, right? Because at the end of Inglourious Basterds, he famously kills Hitler in the most brutal way possible. And so with this one, so again, spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen it, I can understand it. It'll be a little bit more because the movie's only 2 weeks old as opposed to Stranger Things, which is about a month old. But with this movie, the whole thing is that the spoilers is that in the end of this movie, he does change history again when the three Manson people, led by Tex Watson, played in the film by Austin Butler, go to murder Sharon Tate. They don't end up in Sharon Tate's home, and they do not murder Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, and the other two people that were in her home with her. They end up stumbling into Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt's characters, Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth's house. Technically, it's only Rick Dalton's house, and his newly fresh Italian wife is in the house, because him and Cliff are kind of having a little last hoorah celebration, because he's going to have to let Cliff go.
It's the end of an era.
It's the end of an era, right? And so they break into that house, and Cliff violently and viciously fights them off, kind of brutalizes them with
While
their
on
attack
acid.
dog.
While
on
on
acid, too, I will have in mind, having smoked an acid-coated cigarette that he got earlier in the film.
For 50
brutally
cents.
Murders two of them with his attack dog, Brandy. And then the third girl who survives ends up going outside, screaming, runs outside, falls into the pool, and then ultimately gets torched by Rick Dalton and his flamethrower. So that is how Tarantino changed history there. And I will say, what I will say about that is that, yes, you're right. It's a sad fact. Margot Robbie as Sharon Tate does not have a lot to do, per se, in this movie. The epitome of her screen time ultimately consists of going to parties, watching herself in a movie, and having probably, what would you say, like 6, 7, maybe 8 lines of dialogue in the whole movie, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what I will say about that and why it worked for me is because looking at how he changed history this time around, right? Killing Hitler is one thing, right? At this point, it's kind of transcended the idea of wish fulfillment, because everybody knows what an asshole Hitler was. I feel like enough educated people know enough about his background to understand that he was not... He's an evil person, yeah, but he didn't start out that way. It was more so just kind of mishappenstance of circumstance that got that way. But it's gotten to a point where he's just such kind of like come to the idea of represent the epitome of evil in a way that I think has even kind of transcended the devil in terms of most modern day standards, that, like, yeah, anybody can kill Hitler and it'll be fine with it. But what I like about how he changed history in this sense is that the way that Sharon Tate goes down in history is that ultimately she was an up-and-coming actress who had literally no bad blood with anyone. Literally, I don't think anybody had a single bad thing to say about her, who was ultimately in the wrong place at the wrong time and got murdered by some ultimately brutal, awful people, and is ultimately going to go down as a sad tragedy story who never ultimately got to live the life that she wanted. And with Tarantino constructing this movie kind of as almost like a faux fairy tale, I would say, he's even said in certain instances that he constructed this movie like a fairy tale, you're not just seeing wish fulfillment be fulfilled, you're getting to see a person live a life that was ultimately taken from them. And I think there's something ultimately cathartic about that. And I think it is ultimately something that in a way we haven't seen in movies before. And I think there's something that's really, really satisfying about that in the sense of that.
No, sorry. I was going to say yes. So when I said empty, I wasn't bashing the film. In fact,
I figured you weren't.
In fact, I was embracing it. This may be one of my favorite movies of all time. Now seeing it twice, I love it. And I can go see it again in theaters. I'm not going to, but I could. And I would enjoy it just the same. To me, I view it as a love letter. And I view it as a period piece.
Which is absolutely is, both of those things.
To a time in history that I am very much so infatuated with. So I enjoy the scenes of Margot Robbie putting on a Paul Revere and the Midnight Riders album, an obscure 60s band that's painting the picture of the times. I enjoy the scenes of Cliff on the roof fixing the satellite. We're seeing him dealing with the old technology. I enjoy that. And I embrace that. And I love how that challenges, I feel personally, the younger generation because it's exciting in a way that is tasteful, which is something I don't think we get in cinema these days. And I want to transition into the performances.
Yes.
Because to me, they were so subtle, yet so dynamic at the same time.
It's everything you want from a Tarantino performance. And that Tarantino, I feel like, has always managed to nail the perfect line between subtlety and overly bombastic. And that I can't think of a single character from his movies who is not memorable and doesn't have that one moment. But every single one of the people that you watch, they still feel like you're watching like characters. And it's very obviously him, because he very obvious. I've heard this term used by some of his detractors. I famously have a professor up at school who despises the way that he writes movies, but ultimately because you can call the way that he writes his characters wish fulfillment, but you can never deny that when you're watching a Tarantino character.
Yeah, and this movie to me, there's two words I want to use that completely contradict each other, but it's just the way it makes me feel, and I think that speaks to how thought-provoking this film is, that I think the performances are both so minimalistic, yet so dynamic, and I think that's because he's created characters that are so goddamn real that you just can't help but feel sort of cringe the whole time watching this movie, because you're seeing this relationship that is somewhat abusive, but is also loving and isn't perfect. It's about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but it's the ugliest parts of it. And so for me, that's charming to me because I'm sick of being fed the silver spoon of Disney and all these other big powerhouse companies, And so I would love to know, Johnny, what do you think of the performances in this movie? Do you think what makes this movie for you? And honestly, let's dial it back now. Let's jump into do you guys like it? If you like it, why do you like it?
I think we've established at this point that I like it.
I like it too.
I think we've established that.
I like it too, and I think we've sort of talked about why. Johnny's been a little quieter, so I'd love to toss it over to our guest.
Yeah, I definitely like I stated previously before that I wasn't really used to his structure for his film, so it was something I kind of had to digest a little bit. I thought it was interesting how I agree that all the performances were just so really good, and then I like the idea that it's kind of each scene is kind of uniquely good in its own fashion, and then kind of how you piece together all of those scenes is kind of what gathers your personal interpretation of the film. And like I said before, I pretty much agree with all of your interpretations of it, and I think that they're all kind of fantastic if any of them reign true for what would have been in his head when he was writing the film, in terms of him just trying to reach out to the current generation of creators. And I think that that's something that's really fantastic.
Now that is, I'm glad you agree with me. I'm glad we all see it that way, but I think that is me just speculating. And so I have to be honest about that. That's what I hope the intent is.
Yeah.
Because that's how I justify this film. So let's strip that down. Let's take that away. Let's dissect it just from what we just saw. Is it a good film? Taking away all that I just said, because we don't know. There's nothing on record saying this was him slapping the younger generation in the face.
Oh, yeah,
There's
I know.
nothing.
You
know what I mean?
I agreed with you on that interpretation.
Yeah, totally. But do you think, without that interpretation, just sort of based off of what we saw, do you think this is a good film?
Yeah, I mean, me personally, I am more of a fan of linear plots. It was something but then again, like I said, this is the first movie that I've really digested of his, so it's not something that I have a vast knowledge of. Maybe it's something that would grow on me a little bit more, but I definitely think it's a good film. Me personally, I wouldn't say that I loved it, but those are kind of two different schools of thought. There's the objective thought, and then there's the opinion thought. So yeah, that's pretty much my interpretation on that.
Yeah, so if we're talking about, like, I think I've made it more than clear what my stance on this movie is. I'm not gonna lie. Obviously, I'm a huge Tarantino fanboy, but going back to, like, what makes a good film, obviously, like I said, the idea of what makes a good film has become so construed in today's era of pop culture and social media and memes, because I know people whose favorite movie of last year was Venom, and no, I'm not kidding, they were not joking or being ironic about that in any way, shape, or form. And so, obviously, when it comes to taste in art, in anything, is subjective. I was literally just having an argument with somebody about that last night because he was just trying to be a troll and say that the Nolan Batman movies are bad just for the simple fact of he can because, oh, the Nolan movies are bad, and, you know, there's nothing it's like, whatever. The point being is that art is subjective and taste is ultimately subjective, but I think what makes this not only a good film but a great film is, besides all the things of course that you were saying about that, you're right in that you are kind of speculating a little bit in terms of, I don't necessarily think that was his intention going out of the way. I don't think Tarantino's the kind of guy that goes into any movie saying, I'm going to teach the younger generation a lesson. He's never kind of struck me as that kind of a guy. But what I'll say about it is, what I think makes this movie great is that, besides telling a story, besides having great structure, besides having great technical prowess behind it, besides having amazing stars that actually feel like they're being well utilized and not just there because it's an easy celebrity casting, it's a movie that feels like a movie. And I know that people have said this to death at this point, but when you talk about the idea of a cinematic experience, the cinematic experience has become this equivalent of going to a sports game now. And that's ultimately what Disney and Marvel and Star Wars have turned it into. Where, again, people are not cheering at Captain America lifting Thor's hammer because there's any sort of cinematic merit behind it. They're cheering because they're seeing Captain America lift Thor's hammer and everybody else is cheering because of it. And they're getting that rush of endorphins. With this movie, what you're getting is you are getting what movies should be doing and what no other movie, I feel like, is doing. At least no movie that gets the type of level of marketing and attention that the Disney movies get. That's why this is not only a good movie, but a great movie.
I'm curious, with you saying that, we kind of touched before on how we feel like cinema in terms of movies is dying mainly because of streaming and other and culturally and politically, with stuff becoming more political and stuff like that. Do you think that this film could kind of cause some sort of resurgence in cinema in general, or do you think that this is kind of just like another kind of like just spark in like what used to be?
Honestly, that's a great question, because I feel like it could go either way, because I don't like being cynical in every situation, even though I'm a cynical person by nature. So my immediate go-to response is no, this is kind of just a love letter and an ode to kind of the way things used to be, and ultimately that we're kind of not going to get something like this ever again. But I could just as easily be wrong, and this could inspire kind of a new wave of filmmakers to kind of go out and make more endeavors like this. What Hollywood will do is Hollywood will, of course, take the wrong lessons from this and say, oh, this movie was 3 hours. Oh, people like that. We're going to make everything 3 hours now. It Chapter 2, make that 3 hours long. Even though there's no reason for that to be.
It didn't feel like 3 hours at all.
No, it didn't.
I did like
and that's the sign of a good movie.
Yeah.
When it flies by. Because you guys know me. I'm always sipping on some sort of tea or some sort of Diet Pepsi, and the thought of going to the bathroom did not cross my mind once watching this movie, and this was my second time. And again, I did not want to miss a moment, because all I kept thinking to myself while watching this film was, wow, I get to see this in theaters. The full experience is really making this movie happen for me, and this is why I love this movie. And so I didn't want to miss a second of it, and I didn't even think of like, I, for all intents and purposes, wasn't there. I was just simply a part of like the zen of the moment of watching the movie. Like nothing mattered to me. I was completely in tune with this film. And so to answer your question, you know, I think that this movie will inspire young creatives to take a look at the classics.
Johnny's question. But...
Johnny's question, and I think it will create a movement for that. I think we'll see that at film festivals. I think we'll see that at Sundance, and I think we'll see that in Toronto and all these other places. But I don't think that a creator who isn't a Tarantino or a Scorsese will be able to get this movie in theaters and get a widespread release. So I think that, unfortunately, I think that this is a needle in the haystack. I think that the days of this film, this type of film, have come and gone, and that makes me very sad. But I think we have had a few movies in recent history that sort of like strike the same chord. You've had Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson story, which was very incredible, also shot on film. But I
think you'd be surprised at the amount of even blockbusters that are actually still shot on film. Put this in perspective, Pirates of the Caribbean 4 on Stranger Tides, I believe that one was shot on film.
I just mean in the sense that like you really see the grain in the camera.
Okay.
And so it gives you that ambiance where it's like, ooh, this is nice. This feels rustic, yet it's modern. So unfortunately, I do think that we will have this sort of resurgence, but I don't think it's going to permeate through the mainstream. Not as long as Disney is having two of their movies fight to be the most highest grossing movie of all time, two popcorn flicks, Avatar and Endgame. Right. So as long as that's going on,
one of which is 10 years
this
old,
was a flash in the pan.
Technically theirs, they just bought it. But the other thing,
and that makes me so sad.
But the other thing too, just kind of bounce off your point in terms of the why you were talking about, like how like people can get these movies into the theaters based on their name, because that ultimately is unfortunately bringing up the in factor that we're kind of not talking about. And it's fine, we're artists, we're kind of not to, but it ultimately is the reason why both the theaters are dying and that, again, why the only movies that seem to be doing successful in the Disney movies is because money. Because at the end of the day, as much as we love creativity, as much as we preach all creativity and creative genius, Hollywood is a business first and foremost. And as much as we hate it, they're going to go where the money is going. And right now, Disney's where the money's at. And that sucks. And we can hate it all we want, but that's where the money's at, because that's how capitalism works, because that's just the nature of the beast. So the fact that this movie exists and is able to be in theaters and is able to not only be in theaters but be successful and have people talk about it, that's fucking amazing, and we should champion that as much as we can. But we can't lose sight of the fact and delude ourselves in any other way, shape, or form that ultimately, at the end of the day, if something does not make money, it's not going to go very far.
We are the counterculture.
Yes, and that's ultimately the reason why, just on a production standpoint and a distribution standpoint, why everything is going to streaming. Because not only is it cheaper and it gets better word of mouth, but first off, you want to talk about we've never had a time that's been better for young creators and artists. Never, not once in history, because young artists and creators that are coming into the business have never once had this kind of an outlet. Like Scorsese or any of the guys coming up through the 80s and 90s did not have the kind of access to not only technology, but just like the world that we do now with social media and everything, and that's great. Yeah. The downside to that is
much more saturated,
and that's the same across
much more saturation
all forms
with content on everything, right? On all sorts of formats, right? Is oversaturation, so you can't necessarily have the one thing stand out. It makes it a lot harder to stand out. That and the fact of kind of, again, continuing going back based off tradition, the idea of having movie open in theater, it's huge. Everybody's talking about that. That kind of doesn't happen anymore because even if you have something on Netflix, like again, we were just talking about this, one of our most despised things about Bird Box, besides the fact that it's a piece of shit movie, is the fact that people don't even seem to really care about the quality of it. They just like it because A, it inspires a million memes, and it inspired an internet challenge for stupid people to make themselves have a few clicks and likes on the internet. And that ultimately is the future of movies in terms of, like, that's where the money is. That's where, because those are the types of companies that give young up-and-coming artists the distribution and the type of access to those sorts of things that other more so traditional studios would have given them a hard time for, that they would have a lot more easy access to. And just from a purely economic standpoint, it's way better job-wise. Like, in terms of, like, just getting consistent jobs, that's great, because you work, like, 20, 30 odd jobs, right? Who gives a shit where the movie's going? The point is you worked on movies, right? Who's going to turn down the opportunity to work on a movie?
Yeah, and so that is all apparent, and that's great. That is one of the things that is awesome about, the Disney boom. It's giving a lot of people jobs, which is always awesome.
Not just the Disney boom, but I would say the streaming boom more than anything else.
Right, exactly. Like, all having all of these niche shows pop up with their selective audiences. And so I think that the reason we're talking about this right now is because there's no doubt that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a thought-provoking film, right? It's brought us to this whole sort of greater, grandiose conversation. I think that this is something we're going to definitely elaborate more in a further episode. But right now, I want to talk about the other side of this movie, right? Because it's not a perfect film. It has a few things that I think it could have done without.
I'll agree with you there.
And we loosely touched upon it. So let's use the back half of this conversation to sort of, because I always want to show on this show that we're not just sort of like drinking the Kool-Aid of whatever topics we choose to talk about. Because
even if we are fanboys in this situation.
Even if we are fanboys, we have to be better than everyone else.
Yes.
At least that's what I want to try and do, just for the sake of our growth. So what do we not like about this film? Is there anything you guys have that come to mind that you maybe we could have done without, or maybe it wasn't explored enough for you to justify being in the movie? I mean, I don't want to just feed you those if there's anything else you think. Those are my sort of two avenues I would take, but I want to hear what you guys have to say.
I'll say in terms of the movie's imperfections, I'm not going to complain about anything in terms of the sense of I don't think anything in this movie was bad per se in terms of the way that you would present it as being objectively bad. There are a few things I would cut, the number one scene being the Damian Lewis scene, where you have Damian Lewis in there as Steve McQueen, and his only purpose in the movie is to explain the love triangle, if you even call it that, between Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, and Jay Sebring. And I'm like, that's the thing, is I think Tarantino is one of the few people that has always been able to get away with the idea of conversing and transgressing a lot of the action in his movie through dialogue, because again, a whole classic mantra that we talk about in movies is show, don't tell, and Tarantino's very much a fan of telling, but for some reason his dialogue always, and his characters always seem to be interesting and fleshed out enough that you don't really care enough about that. That was probably the one scene and instance where I'm like, okay, you're kind of just telling us everything, and you kind of could have, I feel like that's something we could have easily just guessed based on seeing the dynamic, so I feel like take that scene out, maybe replace it with like a scene like of the three of them interacting, maybe a little bit too traditionalist for him, but just something that doesn't require Damian Lewis in a bad wig doing a Steve McQueen. And I would ultimately say that, like, in terms of like impressions of famous actors, like Mike Moe is Bruce Lee. I thought like he was Bruce Lee. Mara Robbie, I believe, is Sharon Tate. Damian Lewis kind of felt like he was doing a little bit of a Steve McQueen impression. And I get it, it's one goddamn scene in the movie, so I probably sound like I'm nitpicking it. But considering the fact that I was singing this movie's praises before, that's ultimately probably the only scene that I have a little bit of a problem with, Maybe the Zoe Bell scene, but just because of how hilarious that scene was.
See, I really like this movie, so I want to try and justify your critique of that scene, whereas I think that maybe it was forced. I agree with you in the sense that it was forced, but because I love this movie so much...
Not was forced, I say felt forced is what I would say.
Right. I just think he wanted to have a classic legend in the movie, and that was his way of... I think that was a way of, like, if you want to try and justify it as a period piece. But again, I agree with you as that being a critique. I just think it'd be important to, like, let people know that, like, I love this movie so much that, like, I'm just going to find a way to... try and justify probably everything you guys say going forward.
By all means.
So that's why I asked you guys to go first.
By all means.
Just for that fun little dichotomy.
That's what.
But
that's
what do you guys What do you guys think in terms of interpreting the formula of his movies? Like in terms of having a specific start, middle, and end. Like, is that something that you guys find is easy to do with his movies?
I think
because that was like one thing that I was kind of even at the end, I was kind of thinking like I can't tell if it's about to end or not, and I'm just like curious as to you guys who are more familiar with his work.
So I've seen half of his movies, and I've seen parts of the Kill Bills. I would say that it's not going to do you any good to try and put a set formula on him. This isn't a television show where you're getting the same length every time, the same amount of episodes per season. I think with Tarantino, you need to, like we spoke about so much of who he was at the top of this conversation, you need to have your history, which is what we're talking about a lot. You need to know about him, but I think you also at the same time, and this is hard, you need to separate yourself from his other works or from what you've heard because he's so polarizing a figure. So I think you need to look at it as in each of his movies as an individual thing, because he does do the classic story jump in other movies we've seen, like Pulp Fiction.
Well, yeah, that's what I was asking you guys.
But
with
it's
regards to his movies.
But it's
I wasn't saying my
not.
opinion.
Yeah, I know. No, I know what you mean. I'm just sort of like talking to like the listener and saying this. It's not the same. In fact, the effect is completely different, and the pacing is completely different. I think this is one of Tarantino's more slower paced movies I've seen, and I think that pays big dividends in the reward each scene gives you.
Yeah, and to kind of bounce off that a little bit, I would say that in terms of structure, look, every movie that we see has structure, even the most unstructured, like to the point of where I'm literally just seeing images flash on the screen with no dialogue and that seemingly have a little to no importance. Like I said, I mentioned the movie Un Chien Andalou, aka The Andalusian Dog from the 1920s, which is a short half-hour experimental film by Salvatore Dali. I've probably seen it like 4 times now between both Duchess and Oswego, and the whole thing that I can get from that is that every single movie, even that sense, the most experimental you get, has structure to it. Is that things are by nature gonna have structure to it because that's just what we as human beings do. Is because we are constantly attempting to force perceived structure and order onto things when in reality it's just stuff that we've come up with and made up, right? So my whole response to that is Tarantino's movies, like everything else, have a structure. It's just what he's able to do with them is he's able to put his own spin on it so much that it never feels like you're watching like a traditional structured movie. And the other thing that helps too is that not one of his movies feels like it has the same structure. Like Reservoir Dogs, right? It's primarily like you could group that as like just, it's just a bunch of people talking in different rooms. And that's pretty much it, right? And Pulp Fiction, it's like Pulp Fiction is, for lack of a better word, like 3 separate smaller stories that are all happen to be just conjoined, revolved around the same thing, and then split up into non-chronological order, right? And then you probably get, I would probably say probably his most traditionalist film, if you can even call it that before this, was Jackie Brown, which was probably his most slept upon movie from 97. I think that's his only movie that he's done that's based off of an actual pre-existing material. It's based off of a book by Elmore Leonard. And yeah, so in terms of like the whole structure argument, every single one of his movies, like it's kind of a situation where you know you're gonna get a Tarantino movie based on what you kind of perceive as the structure, but like there is structure to his movie is kind of what I'm trying to get to with this tangent.
So like authentically unpredictable.
Yes.
Like it's unpredictable, but in a way that's authentic and specific to him.
Yes.
I would agree with that. And I would also say that if you've seen Pulp Fiction, this movie feels familiar in the sense that it might be
I kind of compare this more to Inglourious Basterds, but in terms of the structure point, but I see where you're coming from.
In structure, to me, it sort of feels more so Pulp Fiction-y in the sense that, you know, you have the title cards and there's a clear, differentiation in time, and there's different storylines happening. Somewhat, they're not out of sequence like Pulp Fiction is, but it's almost like a nod to like, hey, remember that movie in a sense, maybe, but it's that certainly shows like creators have habits and tendencies, but it's still so different than Pulp Fiction, which is like, by all means his most polarizing movie yet. And I think like the reason we're having this
conversation, I disagree with that. I'd say Django is probably his most polarizing.
True. Okay. I guess it depends on the decade. He's sort of a guy.
That's the other big thing.
He's sort of a guy that has made such an impact in every decade so far. I feel like
Pulp Fiction when it came out, though, I feel like again it was just because it was just such a landmark hit, and obviously the '90s kind of not as PC as it is now. But I would say that again the biggest thing is that, and ultimately, like I said, the Me Too movement and ultimately everything that came out post then. I feel like it's a lot more people came out about Django that didn't necessarily come out at the time, and I'm like, okay, so you're full of shit because if you actually felt this way, you probably would have said it when the movie came out. But I know that movie had its detractors like from the minute that movie came out, so I can't really say too much. But like, I know Double Toasted famously has never liked Django Unchained. Mm-hmm. Like, and they're kind of like really and are not fans of his very liberal use of the N-word. And I'm still confused as to how he seems to be the only white guy that everybody is cool with just being able to freely use that word. I will appreciate, though, not one N-word drop in this movie. I think this might be his first movie that did not have a single N-word in it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, maybe that is, in a sense, him sort of succumbing to some of the times and even realizing that he's not untouchable, like maybe some people idolize him to be. But with that being said, we are running a bit low on time here, and it's getting kind of late. So let's wrap this up. Let's go around and sort of give the classic staple of the show rating out of 5 stars. And if this movie got its rating, why did it get that rating you gave it? And would you recommend it to a friend? Because obviously we won't get a sequel in this one.
I want to start with Johnny on this one. I kind of want to have him kick this segment off.
Okay. I think as of right now, I'll give it a 4 stars out of 5. A little bit because just objectively as a movie, I'd probably, I'm kind of trying to even out my opinion versus just the objective quality. And I think that it's something that is definitely a malleable, rating, just from my perspective, in terms of me just needing to familiarize myself with his work a little more and maybe rewatching the film in the future. But especially even just throughout this episode, my opinion on it has changed. Just hearing what you guys have brought up and what you guys think kind of its message has been, and its message might have been on the audience. And I think that is all really interesting. So I don't know. I'd say 4 out of 5 for me right now, but it's definitely subject to change.
Fair enough. I see that. It's all of his movies, in my experience, have led to these kind of conversations where the movie is a catalyst that puts you into completely different conversations. And I think that is the true token of someone who is really challenging you and provoking thought, which is what I look for in art. And so with that being said, I'm going to give this movie, I'm with Johnny, a 4. Because it's not perfect. There is some fat that needs to be trimmed. But all in all, it further makes me sad that I grew up in the era of social media, the era of meme culture, and blatant nonsense, to be honest with you. And it makes me long for something I'll never be able to have, which is a simpler time, and quite frankly, this movie depicts it as a more beautiful time.
Look, I'm not going to pretend that the age that we grew up in did not have its problems. It definitely does. But I think the idea of, I kind of wish or long for simpler times, I think is... I don't want to kind of shit on that statement, but look, everybody kind of has thoughts on the decades we are. I know there are a few people who wish that they grew up in the 70s, and people kind of say, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why would you have wanted to grow up in the 70s, right? I definitely feel that comes down to perspective and kind of nobody ever really wants to kind of acknowledge when they grew up as being great, because if you ask anybody else, everybody's always going to go based on this decade was better per se. But I think ultimately you two both mentioned a word, this is not a perfect movie, right? And I think I want to touch on that a little bit, because as I've been going these last couple of years in terms of, I would say that I consider myself a critic above all else. And what I found is that usually a lot of my favorite moments from movies don't come from the perfect moments. Yeah, the perfect moments can be great if a shot is done well, if you have a line that just hits perfectly, if you have a great performance, right? Those are all great stuff, right? But what I find is usually what, for me, makes the great movies are the imperfections. The little stuff that helps kind of give the movies an identity of their own, right? Kind of maybe little things that I'll incorporate into my personal life. It's I may have liked that movie more than somebody else did for personal reasons, not necessarily owing to craft or anything legitimate, but I feel because movies are supposed to be these things that are made for everyone, I feel I'm kind of a little bit justified by that. I have said on multiple occasions, I've been saying this for a few years now, that I think The Godfather is the greatest movie of all time. And a large part of that is due to personal bias, because I'm Italian, and because obviously I didn't grow up in a mafia family in the 1940s, but I see a lot of similarities between...
Is it obvious?
I was about to say, I was trying to keep it a little bit on the DL, but geez, was that obvious? But no, I see elements of kind of the family structure and dynamic, and kind of things that I see in my own family that I saw in that movie that kind of help give that movie a little bit more of a personal touch to me than maybe somebody else who may regard something a little bit more traditional, like a Chaplin movie, or like Citizen Kane, or something else from the 70s that may speak more socially or culturally relevant, like Taxi Driver or Network, or something more mainstream. But kind of to wrap this up, what makes this movie to me is, besides the fact that it's a movie like that can exist in 2019 and be well received and do well, get word of mouth, make money at the box office, it's the fact that it's a movie from my favorite fucking director that not only proves that he still got it, but also shows that, god fucking damn it, movies can still be well made, well crafted, have great performances, and still have all of their imperfections. And for me, it's the imperfections, the 3-hour runtime, some of the scenes that I may not have liked, some of the fat that you say that needs to be trimmed, for me at least, that makes this a 4.5 kind of a movie for me. With the exception of the Damian Lewis scene, which I would say is probably the only scene if I had to pick that would be cut. That's my rating and my overall final review.
Fair enough. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for joining us for the second episode. We really appreciate that here at Talkin TV. We have a blast doing these, and there'll be plenty more to come. So
yeah, thanks for having me as another guest.
For sure, man.
Yes, definitely.
You're always welcome.
Our second guest.
And, we're going to end this one since it went a little longer. Everything you need to know, where to find it, you're already listening. But if you want social media, if you want to find us on personals, it's all in the description of this episode. So find us there, interact with us there, and until next time.
And watch movies, goddammit. Watch them. I don't care how long they are. I don't care how much you're looking at your phone. Watch movies.
Tip your
and
waitress.
TV. And that.
Watch movies. Spread love.